Perceived Pressure tells stories in the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We recognise that their sovereignty has never been ceded. We recognise that First Nations Australians were the original storytellers of this land and acknowledge the profound and ongoing contributions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to our collective sporting fabric. Michael Lamonato, welcome to Perceived Pressure. How are you, mate?
I'm good. Good to be here. Busy week, obviously. Australian Grand Prix week. It always is, but it's always a fun week, and it feels like it's a bigger part of Melbourne than it ever has been. So the vibes are good.
This is your grand final in a way, isn't it?
yeah, it really is. I mean, it's all encompassing, and it's sort of, we were talking just off air before, but it's become such a big event in Melbourne again. You know, it wasn't that long ago. It was pre-pandemic anyway, which I guess is longer and longer in the rearview mirror. But the Grand Prix kind of got lost in the city, and especially because the AFL season does normally start around now, and that's obviously everything in Melbourne. But now everyone's interested in it. You know, you go down to the bar or the shops, there's an F1 promotion, there's a Formula One car in my local Coles. It's strange, but it's good to be involved.
I guess that's probably a good place to start. Is we're both Victorians, and it has this really, I've always known a world where it is the Grand Prix is in Melbourne, obviously. For older heads, that is a source of great pain because they're South Australian, but it is really deeply embedded into the fabric of the city, and it comes alive when there's these big events over the course of, whether it be the Grand Prix or the Australian Open or whatever it might be, but big international events really sort of bring it alive a little bit. I guess I got a sense the last time I attended, which would have been not the first race after COVID, but the second race. So not that record. I went to that record-breaking sort of first year as well. And then it sort of had the same ticket numbers the year after, but the vibe felt significantly more muted. Do you get a sense that we're coming back to equilibrium a little bit after Drive to Survive Mania a little bit?
It's an interesting question. Like, my barometer for it from the Australian perspective has always been those ticket sales, and they continue to sell out at an alarming rate. I think obviously it's the week of the race now, but I think it's only Thursday tickets you might be able to buy now when there's no Formula One action on. So in that sense, it seems like it continues. Even anecdotally, you go out, you talk to people, everyone still knows something about Formula One. The event itself, it'll be interesting this year. I think for me, the difference between, let's say, 22 and 23 and more recently is I think the event has become run a little bit better. I think it shocked organisers how many people rocked up. I mean, there were stories on the Melbourne Walk where the drivers come down, sign autographs, or I guess selfies these days, not so many autographs. And that was just like, it was a crowd crush, and people were pushing in and pushing around their grannies to get ahead and all that kind of stuff. Now it feels like it is maybe subdued in the sense that it is better organised and people also know how it works. A lot of those people were new to Formula One as an event as well. Like, I've been to the tennis a couple of times. It is a very different event, but it's a little bit more make your own way, I think, than the Grand Prix in some respects, and other events even more so. So maybe it's more everyone just kind of understanding it a little bit. But it has been the question in the Formula One paddock for a long time is when is this bubble going to burst? But we're now, 5 years in, I suppose, and ticket sales everywhere continue to be strong. Interest seems to continue to be high. It waxes and wanes a little bit depending on the year you're having, but so far, maybe plateaued, but I'm not sure we're seeing it decline yet. And I mean, the interesting question is when that might happen, or if it will happen.
I wonder whether we, as Australians, got a little bit... I don't know whether this is the case internationally, but we got a little bit lucky in that we had a very, very popular Australian driver on the grid, 21-22, in Daniel Ricciardo, and then immediately as he sort of fell out of Formula One, well, at least off the grid, we got this prodigy, and we were given another Australian driver, and so there's this gift of two and as long as there's an Australian in Formula One, it seems like that will keep, if it is a bubble, it will keep it alive.
It definitely feels like that. Even Mark Webber transitioning to Daniel Ricciardo, him retiring within a year or two of him debuting was lucky for us. So we've had a really long run of having an Australian on the grid. But I think you're right. Daniel Ricciardo was great. I think that was sort of the spark. I'm glad he was still around in those boom years, because that really ensured it took off. It's taken the public a couple of years to warm to Oscar Piastri, I think, because he's a very different character. Fortunately for us, a very likeable character, I think, but very different to Daniel Ricciardo. And I mean, as you say, and as you know from all the different sports that you've covered, I mean, Australians love a winner. Internationally, at least. I think they love a loser domestically. But in international sport, they love a winner. And Oscar Piastri is very much a winner, so that's helpful.
Yeah, exactly right. It really is fascinating. Where I'll be recording later this week, Touchwood, with friends of ours from ESPN's Far Post podcast, about the Women's Asian Cup, and the question on everyone's lips at the moment is sort of what happened to that bubble? Was that a bubble? Obviously, sort of it's a little bit apples and oranges, but everyone you speak to in football says just wait till the semi-finals, and then everyone will get around it. Which I think is fair. Now, I guess segueing this year, I guess the first thing I wanted to talk about, obviously we have some new regulations which we can discuss as well, but first, very briefly, I want to talk about Cadillac, because it's the first new team in 10 years, I think, since Haas, or first outright new team, first team that hasn't been sort of rebranded or bought out or sold. I guess, what's the vibe here? Ferrari engines, GM re-entering Formula One for the first time in God knows how long now. GM being in Formula... It might be... Is it the first time GM's been in Formula One? It's been a long, long time. At all, since GM sort of even had engines entered, and back when it was, back when the Indy 500 was part of the World Championship and so on. But yeah, what are the expectations for Cadillac this season? Is this an all-work... It's not really an all-works effort in one sense, but in another sense it is. Sort of GM trying to find a slice of that pie.
Yeah, you're right. It's not quite an all-works effort, and the team is operated by what is called TWG Racing, which is the same organisation that was Andretti. And you'll remember that Andretti, by the son of Mario Andretti, the Formula 1 world champion, Michael Andretti, also a former Formula 1 driver and racer in his own right, was rejected by Formula 1 for not bringing enough value to the sport, and the sport suspected he'd be shambolically slow and underestimated the challenge of Formula 1. And remarkably, fundamentally, the same team is turning up and probably not even going to be last. I mean, maybe by the end of the year they'll be last. But I mean, if Aston Martin sounds like everything that they were worried Cadillac was going to be, and I say that not necessarily to make fun of Aston Martin, though the story there is remarkable, but because Cadillac's done a lot better than I think a lot of people expected. And a lot of this is going to sound like a backhanded compliment, because I still expect them to be right at the back of the field and finishing probably last in the championship realistically, but you never know, maybe ahead of Aston Martin. But they've done such a good job of being prepared. Like, they were the first team to shake down the car in a private test of any team, and they were among the first to get out on the first day of testing. I mean, a couple of minutes here and there, whatever it is. And were just very solid and completed their program. Didn't complete anywhere near the most laps, but they completed enough laps to feel like they were ready. There were fears that they wouldn't even have the speed to qualify in Australia. I mean, it does remain to be seen, but it would be a shock if they didn't, because they were very much on the pace of the back of the midfield throughout testing. So this team does look like a very competent, solid base. They've got a lot of good people in there. In Sergio Perez and Valtteri Bottas as the drivers, they've got two known quantities, very experienced, good benchmarks. They're realistically only going to be there, you'd think, for a couple of years before they go for some younger, racier guys. But nonetheless, we shouldn't underestimate their abilities there either. So I think optimism for this team being sustainable is good. But realistically, I think, they're going to be out in Q1. They're going to be scrapping to be lapped only once or twice at most races. But they'll be hoping for, some rain here or there, or some wacky circumstance to pinch a point or two. But it looks good, at least. It just does not look like the shambolic effort that F1 was alleging it was going to be before they changed the name.
It's it strikes me as bad juju, in a sense that they've got just not as a slight on them personally, but just the teams that they're formerly associated with. I've got, it's being run by Graham Loden, who used to be CEO of Virgin and Marussia and all of these sort of all of these sort of names from 15, from my childhood, weird, wacky, the last of the weird and wacky sort of privateer entries into Formula One. But I guess, and actually probably the last in that spirit was Aston Martin being bought out by Lawrence Stroll. And I guess talk me through the drop off and study the drop off with me here. What happened? We had a team that very briefly was a legitimate constructors championship threat for a fleeting moment when sort of those Mercedes units were sort of at their peak. Now they've moved to Honda Works engines and who don't ever seem to have a decent first year. And yet somehow they keep getting contracts. So I guess walk me through, how has this happened? It feels really undignifying for someone like Adrian Newey to walk into this scenario.
Yeah, remarkable too. I was reminded yesterday that the person who had a role at least in signing Honda up to McLaren for the 2015 season that was so similarly disastrous was Martin Whitmarsh, who also did the same thing at Aston Martin. So he's made the same mistake twice. But to be fair to him, when he signed for Aston Martin for the Honda contracts, Honda was winning championships with Red Bull Racing and titles with Max Verstappen. So it seemed less of a stretch, and I'm sure even he didn't expect this was going to happen again. It is remarkable. We don't know how much responsibility, and I don't say that in like a very heavy-handed way, but the car, we don't know if it is good or not either. When McLaren had the Honda power unit, they were adamant the car was really great, and then they switched to it and they realised, actually, the car's not very good. And some of the things that Honda was saying was also true. And we can see that this car has some problems. The gearbox is not very good. It's the first time they've built that, I think, in around 20 years, that team, going back all the way to when it was Jordan. And the design itself is very aggressive, very Adrian Newey, but Adrian Newey hasn't built only great cars. Some of them have been potentially very great, but also unable to finish races. But it is the engine that's the biggest problem, because the engine is shaking itself to death, essentially, as I understand it. The battery cannot survive the vibrations, and they don't understand why that's happening. It seems like a couple of different things have combined for this. One is that in 2021, or ahead of 2021, Honda did withdraw from Formula One. Typical of Honda, to withdraw just as they started winning titles. They were convinced to remain in enough by Red Bull Racing to supply the engines. Some reliability development was done, but it was a much smaller scale. And then weren't convinced to rejoin Aston Martin as the works partner, because by then Red Bull had committed to building its own engines, until around about a year after the engine rules were published, which means everyone else had already been working on the engines for about a year, very similar to what happened in 2014 or 15 when they joined a decade or so now. And lo and behold, they've turned up with an engine that probably is about a year behind in development. And then when you combine it with the relationship being brand new with Aston Martin, the massive hierarchy changes at Aston Martin, with Adrian Newey becoming the boss, Andy Cow moving to manage the engine, who was the CEO, other reshuffles at that team, the new factory, they're building the gearbox for the first time, as I said, the rear suspension, and the weight of expectation to match the weight of Lawrence Stroll's wallet as well. Then it's kind of, all those little cracks are now breaking open a little bit. And it's a really big test for this team's culture now, something we haven't thought too much about previously. But it's because of those expectations that the team wanted to be taking a big step forward this year. Does Lawrence Stroll, who by all accounts I wasn't in testing, but was skulking around looking pretty unhappy, stomping around, some people said, if he starts swinging for changes, I think that is an indictment on the culture. But if he allows Adrian Newey, who does have a small share in the team as well as being the boss, to patiently work his way through it, because there's nothing that they can do to avoid probably not finishing the Australian Grand Prix or the first few races, then that will be a positive step at least. They can move forward. McLaren got better eventually. Honda also won titles before McLaren got better. They can get out of this, but they need to be patient. I think that's the test.
Is there, I guess on that culture note, have we sort of seen this conversation a little bit before, where there was a risk when the last time that Lawrence Stroll saw his son sort of languishing at the back of the grid in a bit of a loser of a car, that he would pack up and leave, and that was the dream was over. Is there a risk of that, or is the sense that Lawrence Stroll will simply throw more money at it until it does work, or make changes until it does work?
Well, I think to answer the money question first, I don't know if he can throw any more money at this team. He spent so much on it already, and there is a cost cap now. So I think he's at his... that at least prevents him from either totally financially obliterating himself. I think it would take a lot to do that, to be honest, considering his personal wealth. But he's already spending at that level. The difference between Aston Martin and Williams, as it was where Lawrence Stroll was before, where Lance Stroll, both of them were before, I guess, is that Lawrence owns this team with a consortium, but he's the peak owner, essentially. My understanding, if I cast my mind back, and it was probably about a decade ago now, or nearly, was that he wanted to be more involved in Williams, but Williams was then still the family-owned team and didn't want any of it. And as a result, packed up and left. So what he's got at Aston Martin is as a result of him not being allowed to do what he wanted at Williams. There is always the question of when he will choose to exit Formula One. He says he's committed, and I mean, the money he's spent really does suggest he is committed. Keeping his son involved is that question mark, and it's almost more like, well, when's Lance going to decide he's had enough? Will he have to race until he's 50? Is he allowed to tell his dad he's had enough? It's hard to know. But the team itself is set up for success, and presumably if he did sell it, I mean, he'd make a massive profit because Formula One's so hot right now, and buyers are everywhere and interested. So the team is pretty set up for the long term, whatever the case. But I mean, it is about what he wants to get out of it. And I mean, if he just wants to be a team owner, then he is in that sense doing a good job because the team's very well resourced.
I guess when we're talking about team dynamics, this might be the last team question I have before we get into sort of all of the weird and wacky changes they've decided to bring in for 2026. But McLaren, obviously, two Australians on a Formula One podcast. We can't skip by McLaren. I guess, is there a sense you get of, and maybe we're not objective here, but is there a sense you get of, whether McLaren were legitimately prioritising Lando over the course of last year, whether that was just a bunch of coincidental strategy stuff-ups, or I guess more relevantly, what the vibe is going to this year with Norris as world champion and I guess an established pecking order now set and no further clarity on whatever the fuck papaya rules are supposed to be.
Well, they have tried to address the papaya rules nonsense it was interesting. Andreas Taylor spoke, the team principal, it was maybe about a month ago now, sometime during testing, and he was asked, he said, no, it worked pretty well, I think, and we're going to keep it, and then had in brackets at the end of it, but we're going to streamline it a bit. And then we spoke to Oscar maybe a week later, and he was like, no, there's going to be changes, it's going to be much more simple and all that kind of thing. Because I think even by the end of the year, even they had realised that it had become too unwieldy, despite insisting that, it's just really, they don't hit each other. It's clearly more than that. So that will change. As for the bias question, there was no real sign of any favouritism. The team, I think really what we saw in all those strategy decisions, there were quite a few that both embarrassed the team at times and appeared to give the impression that Norris was getting favourable treatment, was this team really tying itself in knots, attempting to do what very few other teams have ever successfully done, which is trying not to prioritise the drivers. And at times was actively not prioritising them. And then accidentally that meant, Lando Norris, the Italy pit stop thing, I understand the justification for it, but it's pretty unusual in F1. And then we had the variety of run-ins, like Singapore should have been acted on earlier, but they didn't know what to do about it. And then I think Qatar was the one that really brought it home, while it wasn't really actively favouring anyone, they admitted afterwards that it played a role, that they didn't want to harm Lando Norris too much because he would have been double stacked, and therefore they sort of seized up and didn't pit, and they didn't think everyone else would, and all that kind of stuff. So I think that it'll be good if they just sort of take their hands off the wheel a little bit, or loosen the grip or something like that. But the favouritism there, I don't think has been there. I think the only thing you could ever say is that there would have been, I'm sure, even if they don't admit it, even emotional preference is probably too strong a word, but Lando Norris has been that team for a very long time. He was a McLaren junior. They gave him his shot in F1. They've both kept the faith in each other, and we can't forget that Norris for a good few years was rated much more highly than McLaren was, and could have left and had offers to leave, and he didn't, and it came good. So I think, when people say, "Oh, Zach Brown clearly likes Lando Norris more," we shouldn't forget they also went to court to get Oscar Piastri, so they do really like him as well. And Andrea Stella has many times, and he's worked with these people, rated him alongside Michael Schumacher and Fernando Alonso as a great young talent. But there maybe there would have been some emotional satisfaction, I think, in seeing Norris get the job done last year, because the team was so invested in him for so long. That's not to say they wouldn't have been happy to see Oscar win the title, as they presumably would be this year. But that was the only thing. And then this year, I mean, the hierarchy remains to be seen. I think that is an interesting question, what the dynamic will be this year. The two drivers are fairly chill as people. I mean, they're also all obviously going to fight their own corner. And Oscar at times did have some pretty stern words with the team when he wasn't happy with the way it was going. But, having the number one on one of the cars, having one of them as the reigning champion, if it is close again between them, that will be interesting.
Is there a world in which Oscar says, and a long history of Australian drivers, and to be fair, not just Australian drivers, but a long history of spurned drivers who believe they should be clear number ones, sort of up and leaving before the end of a contract. He's contracted through to 2028, I believe, might be 2027. Is there a sense you get of him forcing a move if it doesn't work out with a clean slate, like we've just discussed? Obviously, there's an interesting. I feel like there's potential. Sorry, I was just going to say I feel like there's potential for more movements in the state of the driver market this year. Not major movements, but some.
Yeah, it absolutely is. There's a vast majority of drivers who are out of contract this year, not by accident because of the rule changes. I don't see it happening this year because it would need a mighty blow up of some kind to force him out this year, or to discover the McLaren's actually nowhere near the front and it's become a basket case. But I don't think that's going to happen. There's an interesting statistic a friend of mine put me onto that is actually extremely rare, and I think this is the thing that perhaps might prompt him to move, although he's clearly world championship potential and I think he can beat Norris, but very rare to win your first world title if your teammate has also won his first world title before you, if that's not too complicated a statistic. So the last driver to do it was Nico Rosberg in 2016. Hamilton already won the title, then he won in after two at Hamilton Mercedes. Previous driver was Alain Prost, who beat Niki Lauda in, and the year has escaped me, 80-something. So very rare is what I'm saying. And that perhaps speaks to the... 87 sounds right. Terrible with years, to be honest. I'm Googling a long time, whatever that would be. It's nearly 40 years. You give it a Google for me. That perhaps speaks to the previous question of what happens when one of the drivers does become a world title, to that internal dynamic at the team, even if the team continues to keep them both equal. Maybe something subtly changes enough that drivers inevitably feel like they have to move. I mean, it was a similar reason, I guess, that Daniel Ricciardo left Red Bull. Max Verstappen hadn't won the title, but he felt like the team had just moved towards Max, which I think it pretty clearly has. It's pretty clear that was the case. But then obviously set him on a road that led to him exiting the sport probably ahead of time or without the results you would expect. So that's something for Oscar to consider. But as long as he's got a car capable of winning and winning titles, he's still obviously still young enough, but he's still inexperienced enough relative to Norris that I think you can excuse, if that's the word, for him to keep trying at McLaren, to keep trying to beat Norris. So I think that question doesn't come up for a couple more years, until he's there. And if Norris wins another title, maybe that changes things as well. But if he's there for a couple of years, hasn't beaten Norris, they haven't won more championships, then maybe he thinks about sort of making his own path, because Norris clearly wants to be, I think, a McLaren lifer if he can do it. But I think for now, it's McLaren for him.
1985 is the answer. Obviously, it actually struck me how, in such short succession, how quickly Alain Prost won those 4 world titles. But yeah, 1985. But I guess the next question is in respect to the regulations. Couple of weird ones. Obviously, for those novices to Formula One, DRS is out. And has been replaced with an overtake button, fundamentally, a push-to-pass button. I guess, is there a sense of whether this has any functional difference in terms of you still can only use it really when you're within a second of the car ahead. Is there a sense of whether the changes will actually be better for overtaking? Obviously, the cars are have significantly less downforce as well, and so when they open up on what they call straight mode, it will be significantly, like it'll be a significant shift in downforce sort of dynamics.
Yeah, that's on paper. There's no real difference. Like, it works in exactly the same way fundamentally. The overtake button, got to be within a second. It's not certain zones that's a difference, but realistically, it only works at the end of the straights. It's about preventing the electrical energy from tapering down to zero for a little bit longer, so you can reach a higher speed before the electrical energy runs out. So on paper, it should work in pretty much the same way, and it should be pretty clear as well, because at some point you're just going to have more power than the other car. So if you're close enough, it should work out. And then adjusting the distance and all that kind of stuff is probably the FIA's challenge. But according to probably most drivers at this point, and certainly to Andreas Taylor, the team boss who's talked about this a little bit, it's not going to work at all because the cars don't have enough energy to use it. This is the problem with these rules, or it seems to be the problem, and I think it's probably going to be most acute in Melbourne, or among tracks anyway. Melbourne will be among the most acutely affected because it's such a difficult track to recharge the battery around, and that is the primary challenge of these new engines. So if you're already running out of electrical power, not just tapering down to zero, but just running out halfway down the straight, well, then it doesn't matter if you have access to theoretically more, because it's not in there. It's not in the battery. So that, I think, is sort of the sting in the tail of the way the rules have been written, is that there may not actually be effectively an overtaking aid. Some tracks it will work. Street tracks are probably going to be quite good. It'll be interesting when we get to our first street track. People have suggested that tracks like Monaco, the engines will be very much at home because they'll be perpetually full, and so we'll get to see the full idea of how powerful they are, and they're among the most powerful ever regulated in the sport. But again, a track like Australia, which is mostly flat out, not very many slow corners anymore, not very many big braking zones anymore, it's unlikely, it would seem, that the cars will have very much energy at all left by the end of the front straight or the back straight at the various places you might be able to use it. There are some levers the FIA can pull to make that work. They're not likely to pull them, well, certainly not before this weekend starts. Perhaps they'll get to the end of Friday and make some changes. That involves things like allowing more charging opportunities and also just decreasing how much power the cars can use, so that you have more left over a longer period of time. I suspect it'll probably move in that way again, because we know Australia is going to be a pretty stern test, and we'll see what almost the worst case scenario is, and they'll try and make sure that doesn't happen again. But it will be interesting. I guess there has been a lot of pessimism, and obviously from the sport, some attempts of forced optimism. It'll land somewhere in the middle, but I suspect probably more towards that pessimism side.
Is that probably your biggest concern with the new set of regulations? I mean, the cars are supposed to be a little bit smaller, a little bit less sticky, and I guess, and like lap times are going to, it appears, are going to blow out a little bit.
Yeah, it's going to be pretty track dependent on the lap times. Like if we go to Bahrain, the lap times are only about 3 seconds slower than pole last year, which is pretty normal for regulation changes. There's only been, well, like in my time covering the sport, it was really only in 2017 they changed the rules actively to make the cars faster, but it made overtaking much worse. So usually it slows the cars down when they change the rules, and then over the years, designers figure out the loopholes and all that kind of stuff, and the cars get faster. So that's not that unusual. But at a track like, again, Australia, where the engine will be more energy starved, they'll probably be slower. But then again, when we go to places like Monaco, I think these cars could probably even be faster than last year. So it depends a little bit on that. But yes, it is the energy management that I think is the concern for this set of rules. I think, like lap to lap, it's probably going to be less noticeable than we think. You'll probably notice, even if you're in person, if you're at the end of the straights, you'll hear the cars effectively come off throttle a little bit. Through some fast corners, if you look on board in Bahrain, you'll hear the engine like fully open and the car will be slowing down. I don't know if that'll probably be noticeable in person, I guess, but they're still going so fast you may not have time to twig it. So on track, they're not actually going to look that different, but I think where it's going to be affected is in that racing component. Now, that said, Lando Norris said just after the first test, so maybe before everyone had a real full understanding of how this was going to go, is that there is still a lot in the hands of the drivers. You know, you could save your battery theoretically for one long straight and you would have all of that power, but you'd be much slower at other parts of the track, but maybe you think you can defend. So there is the potential that drivers take this all into their own hands a little bit more than probably the engineers would prefer. And we do get some, I think in his words, chaotic action, because it's just things that wouldn't normally happen with a regular car because massive power differences at different parts of the track. So we could be optimistic about that. But on paper, you know, if the engineers were engineering their perfect execution of the engine and the car and over a race distance, then it would be pretty straightforward, and I think that would be a concern. But I mean, that's sort of the beauty of a rule change and having round one in Australia is we don't know, and we'll find out.
And I guess speaking of Australia specifically, there's sort of been, or Victoria specifically, there's been a couple of other changes around sort of the state's motorsport slate over the course, or going forward. And those pesky South Australians have got one back. And MotoGP, of course, has been at Phillip Island for as long as I've been alive. But is there a sense of what the future is for MotoGP sort of ever coming back to Victoria, sort of the impact of what the loss of that has had on particularly the local Phillip Island economy, but the state economy broadly, and I guess whether Albert Park was ever a realistic option. We've heard quotes from state government officials particularly that the ask was Albert Park. I guess, was that ever realistic? And was there a world where we could have seen motorbikes going around Albert Park? That's a very multi-pronged question.
Because I'll try and address every prong as best I can. I think Albert Park, no. You would know, as I do, that just even setting up Formula One and any changes to that, to the track or the surrounds of it is always highly contentious. So the idea of ripping down probably hundreds more trees to have a motorcycle race and shutting the park for an extra fortnight just was going to be way too politically difficult, even if it's only in one state electorate. Like it's hard. It would be a hard sell. And MotoGP just doesn't have the profile of Formula One to influence that. You know, Formula One was coming to Melbourne for the first time today. You probably could just about pull off an Albert Park for the first time because F1 is so big. But MotoGP will be just a much harder sell. Also, you've got to consider that MotoGP was really critical to the economy down in Phillip Island and Gippsland a little bit more generally. Comfortably the biggest event, I would have suggested, that happens down there. Not an expert on the Phillip Island events. So Penguin's a pretty big draw, I guess, but a bit more spread out over the year. So that is a big loss. And then to have said, you know, in an election year as well, to have said, we're going to take your biggest event and put it in Melbourne. What person living in any of Australia's regional areas loves to hear that their big events are going to the capital city? So that just wouldn't have flown. So it was a bit of a catch-22 position for the government or for the Grand Prix organisers here, but it also seems like when MotoGP made this demand, which seems to have been relatively late in the piece, like perhaps only at the end of last year or earlier this year, it has already been in extensive talks with Adelaide. Adelaide had seen its opportunity already because first of all, the Shaheen family understood that there was they had the connections with MotoGP and understood there was an opportunity, not least because the investment in Phillip Island's been so poor. There's some, I guess, responsibility for the government there, but Phillip Island's also a privately owned racetrack by the Fox family, and I can tell you, there's a single toilet block for the entire paddock, and nothing's been renovated since the 90s, I think, since MotoGP got there in 97. Other than the circuit itself has been kept in good condition, but everything else around it is just so not up to MotoGP standard. Plus, we have MotoGP really apparently wanting to race on a street circuit, and so when Adelaide said they were willing to, I think, also probably pull down more trees than they're saying at the moment, just looking at the map, and maybe even tearing down some buildings, but that's a matter for them. They were pretty attracted by that option, and street tracks have done good things for F1, even though we've probably got a couple more of them than we need. So I understand that, but then if you speak to a couple of journalists in MotoGP, and I don't pretend to be plugged into MotoGP like I am F1, so I'm sort of really just going on what I'm hearing here. And I'd love to hear from anyone else in Adelaide if you're getting a similar vibe, is that they're going to have a crack at the street track, but they know they've got the bend in their pocket. And to come to, I believe, the final prong of your question, what are the odds of it coming back to Melbourne or to Victoria? I think if that's what happens, if that's true, that really, even though I know the Premier there has said that absolutely it's not about going to the Bend, it is about being in the city, so he's denied it. If they just end up at the Bend for 6 years, they've traded one similarly regional circuit, but one of the greatest in the world, for the Bend, which is a terrific facility. I haven't been, but from people I've spoken to who have been, state-of-the-art facility. But as a racing track, it is what it is. Then I think perhaps if the upgrades have been made to Phillip Island, and I think the Fox family would be wise to do it, perhaps the government too, I don't know, maybe they say, why don't you come back to one of the greatest motorcycling races in the world? That's the only way I can see it coming back to Melbourne, because if the street track happens and if it's a success, that to me screams this is a long-term home for the race, because it would become such a feature event.
No, absolutely, and I've just looked up the election results for the seat of Bass at the last election, and it's extremely tight. It's a 0.9% margin for Jordan Crugnali, the Labor member there. I mean, one of a number of sort of really interesting races, I guess, come November. And I guess on politics, which will probably be the last and thorniest issue we discussed on this really, really fun chat. We're recording at 7 o'clock in the morning here. And so it's a hell of a way to start the morning. Neither of us are caffeinated, presumably, either. Yeah. But so our apologies in advance. But I guess a number of geopolitical challenges for Formula One sort of have cropped up at the start of the season. Obviously, sort of the Israeli-American strikes on Iran have resulted in a number of retaliatory strikes across a number of Gulf nations aligned with the US that also host Formula One races. So Bahrain's been hit. Dubai doesn't host Formula One, but sort of has the UAE has been hit. Abu Dhabi's been hit. Qatar is obviously sort of has a number of US bases. And so there was obviously a scramble leading into this race from a logistical point of view of packing up the circus and bringing it to Melbourne, and for those flights to come via the Middle East. But obviously the start of this season has a number of races that are in the Middle East. So they're scheduled for... Riyadh as well. Sorry, the US Embassy in Riyadh was hit as well. We have a race in Jeddah coming up soon. We have a race in Bahrain in mid-April. Then we go to Saudi Arabia. Then we go... I think later on in the year we'll go to Abu Dhabi, and Qatar is somewhere in the middle there as well. So I guess, is there a concern as to hosting and any potential changes to the schedule? Is that something that feels really alive at the moment as a possibility?
It's certainly a talking point. Not to make light of the situation at all, but I was talking to a colleague yesterday, and I'm sure this happens in other media sectors as well, or other sports media sectors. But Formula One particularly, because it's always exposed to random things happening, whether geopolitical or weather systems and all that kind of stuff. But within an hour or two of something happening, a handful of journalists suddenly are experts in something they don't know anything about. I've seen it happen in Japan. We've been stuck in typhoons, and suddenly I'm sitting next to an expert meteorologist, apparently. And there are going to be some geopolitical experts as well telling you what they know. But I mean, it's obviously all moving pretty quickly. Everything's arrived in Melbourne because it all arrives the weekend before the race, which means everything sort of got in just before tensions really flared in the Middle East. Some people struggled. Formula One organised some charter flights for paddock and team personnel who couldn't reroute with enough time. A colleague of mine, Chris Medlin, ended up with a 44-hour door-to-door journey because he had to go via the US and then via Fiji and then via Brisbane and then got to Melbourne. So he did very well to get here. So there'll probably be a couple of fewer, probably fewer journalists and things like that, but the sport itself will get underway in Melbourne. And then fortunately for Formula One after this is the Chinese Grand Prix directly. There'll be no problems there. Then Japan as a standalone, there'll be no problems there. But it is only about a month till we head to, as you say, Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. We only got news overnight that, or when we're recording this on Wednesday morning? Can't remember what day it is.
Yeah, Wednesday morning,
that the World Endurance Championship, which was due to open its season in the Middle East in about 2 weeks in Qatar, has postponed that race, but will open instead its season in April in Italy. Teams tend to be based in Europe, so that's much easier. So about a month from now, I mean, I couldn't predict what's going to happen, but if it were to be hosted, I mean, as WEC has shown, if it were to be hosted more imminently, it couldn't happen. And it couldn't happen because, well, principally because, if nothing else, airspace is closed. You cannot get into these countries. It will be interesting to see Formula One. I mean, I'm not an expert on the politics of the World Endurance Championship. Formula One tends to default to, we're going to race if we can go there. Again, I'm not one of the geopolitical experts in the paddock, but from what I've checked, and at least at the time of recording, you can fly to Jeddah because that's part of Saudi Arabia that's not currently subject to airspace restrictions. And if the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia reckons we're good to go, then we will be good to go. It was only 2022, for example, that during practice there was a Houthi missile strike 10 kilometres from the track. Drivers debated, and I think the sense I got was the drivers would have preferred not to be there at that point. But Saudi Arabia said it was safe, therefore F1 said it was safe, and therefore the race got underway as scheduled. So I think that's a pretty good template for it. Even if we think back to 2020 COVID, you know, Lewis Hamilton's cash is king comment isn't wrong. But if you do look at it from the F1 perspective, they're contracted to host a race. If the country says they want the race, then it's up to F1 to decide to take the financial hit, and the teams as well. Everyone takes a hit subsequently because they have to pay out for losses and breach of contract. So it puts them in a difficult position. Bahrain's a different question because that is closed and that's a little bit closer. Jeddah's on the west coast of Saudi Arabia, so perhaps a little bit separate, but again, not a geopolitical expert. We have to wait and see. Formula One was prepared for this though, because at the end of last year, that the previous round of tensions in exactly this region with exactly these people involved, Qatar and Abu Dhabi were set to end the season, and it did look like perhaps there could be effects there. Ultimately, there weren't, but there were plans to hold the end of the season elsewhere. I suspect they will have the same plans. If both were called off, I'd guess it would probably be replaced with one race in Europe. They're fortunate that there's sort of weeks on either side of those two races, but we'll have to wait and see how it all evolves, obviously, because it's moving pretty fast, and who's to say where we are in a month's time?
It does. I personally, I can't wait for an episode of Drive to Survive and Will Bucks. Actually, to be fair, I think he actually did study international relations at university, but
he might be the only one who's allowed to comment.
And he'll be sitting there just. And if you bomb a racetrack, it means you can't race. But he's just gonna cop shit having one of the only people in the paddock that is qualified to speak. It might have been political science, but in any sense, I guess the other side of this, and this is, I think the fascinating part is the drivers not necessarily wanting to be there, and countries saying, if it's good to go, it's good to go, and that not necessarily being objective. And is there a world where we? I guess you sort of half answered it there, but is there a world where, Saudi Arabia, for example, says, we're good to go, fellas? Haven't you seen all the Instagram reels that are popping up over people's feeds about how they all feel safe and protected with the same music over the background? It's all good, play on. And Formula One says, no, actually, this is a threat to the safety of whatever major stakeholder it might be, presumably. Or the Drivers' Association says, no, we're not racing.
I think probably not on the Drivers' Association part. There have been times in history when the Drivers' Association has been politically powerful. And it seemed like maybe it was going in that direction not that long ago, but I don't get the sense, although maybe this is the issue that ends up making them find their voice, but I don't get the sense that happens. A lot of them take the position, as a lot of sports people do now, that they're ultimately contracted to a team to do a job, and the team says they're going, then they're going. Despite there being some examples of Formula One soldiering on in circumstances it probably shouldn't. Soldiering on is probably an interesting phrase for this situation, but it hasn't waded into what is essentially an active war zone yet, to be fair. So maybe this is the time that Formula One says, hey, this is a bit too dicey for us. Could be image issues as well. Like, the sport is conscious of its image, even though it does sometimes push the envelope. If Bahrain, for example, were to make special exception for F1's planes to land, maybe they wouldn't take that up as just one example. But it's hard to say, because we also shouldn't forget Saudi Arabia is a massive investor in Formula One, as well as some teams, Aston Martin not least of all, and Bahrain owns McLaren. So it would be an interesting situation. There would certainly be one where, if Bahrain really was insisting, or Saudi Arabia really was insisting, as the bombs rained down that everything was good, surely someone in F1 would go, maybe not. But if it were in that grey area, we were in that grey area in Bahrain in 2012 during the Arab Spring. We did call off one race, but then in 2012 it continued despite ongoing protests. Yeah, it's tended to fall in the position that it's better not to race. But that said, a lot of the organisers in the Middle East are conscious of how that would look then on them, and then might preemptively call it off. It's going to be a politically, for Formula One, dicey situation if things die down and they're kind of put in that position. And while there have been similar ones, nothing quite like this to my knowledge. So it's a little bit of a wait and see, but you can bet they're thinking pretty hard about it because they know the decision's going to have to be made at some point.
There always strikes me as sort of a bit of a tension between Formula One's new audience as well, who are, overwhelmingly like young women, and who, as a group, generally speaking, overwhelmingly progressive and conscious of all of the various sort of, and you touched on it before, sort of various image issues that arise with the various nation states that Formula One involves itself in and invests itself in. And Formula One, as a collective going, well, this has always been this way, welcome to the show. So there's more of a comment than a question, given time, but as Tony Jones would say. But Michael Lamonato, thank you very, very much for joining me at, in the wee hours on Perceived Pressure. And enjoy the race.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you very much.